Welcome back, everyone, to the Resource Adequacy Workshop and our specific meeting on hedging and an additional presentation by Kalwia. I just wanted to remind everybody to please mute your lines, and also, and when you do have a question, which I'll be monitoring both in the conversation and raising hands, just please introduce yourself and your organization. So thank you all very much, and thanks again to all the presenters. And Dariush, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm hoping that everybody can see my screen.
Yes, it's perfect.
All right. During the previous presentation that we had on this subject, regardless of, by the way, what framework is picked up, eventually we need to know what's the qualifying capacity of variable energy resources, wind and solar resources, and the discussions of using exceedance method, ELCC, and we proposed a topic as an approach for calculating QC, which was based on a sort of weighted average of wind and solar generation. And the weighting was supposed to be the ratio of the actual load at the time of actual solar generation. We're talking historical and solar or wind generation. And this was intended to capture the correlation between the solar and wind generation and actual load. And as a result of that, actual need in the system for capacity. We noticed as we applied this method to actual data that there are some anomalies, and we modified the approach a little bit with the same intent to make sure that the qualifying capacity of wind and solar resources are captured in such a way that the value in helping with capacity needs is captured by effectively accounting for correlation between wind and solar generation and load. So my favorite topic, bashing exceedance method, and I'm going to basically show you some examples that show how exceedance can lead us badly lead us into the wrong places, especially if we have limited sample data. These are of course concocted pieces of data. I'm not sure we run into situations like this ever, or often enough. But the point is, if we go based on this 24 hourly slices for each month of the year, and given that based on at least our research, we couldn't find more than 3 years worth of actual wind and solar generation going backward on CAISO website, Oasis, we have very limited sample for every hour, for each slice, which would be 1 hour of the month. We will have only 93 samples. If we have 4 years, it will be 93 plus 31. And that's provided that that's a 31-day month, say August. So we have a limited number of samples for calculating qualifying capacity of a variable energy resource for a particular hour. And so we are dealing with limited number of data points to work with. In this example, I want to talk about how exceedance works. It shows various generation, maybe hour ending 16 and and I'll ending maybe 18 in different days of July, for example, or whatever month. Load level happens to be varying quite a bit in this range. Again, this is a concocted case. And it so happens that the output in one sample happens to be like this, and in another sample happens to be like this. Not much different, except 1 hour is shifted. Used to be 1,000 megawatt, becomes 100 megawatt. These I picked randomly. It completely, Exceedance completely forgets about this. It doesn't care what load was, whether load was high and needed the capacity, or low and didn't need the capacity. It looks at generation on its own. And also, the way it does, it just looks at the data and see at which point you go above 50% or 60% or 70%. So if for example, we pick 60% exceedance for any resource, and we had these kind of samples, again, this is just to exaggerate the issues with exceedance. We can see in one sample, these two samples are not much different. But in one sample, we'll see 1,000 megawatt as the qualifying capacity of the resource. And in this sample, we see only 100 megawatt. Again, I don't expect a particular variable energy resource, even wind, to vary this much. But I just wanted to illustrate what we are getting into with exceedance. And again, we only have 93 data points to work with. So things could be as we actually can share with you the actual data for some of the, and you can see that the output of even solar resources can vary dramatically for a particular hour in month of August, and we'll share that with you. So the good thing about what we call ENLR, or effective net load reduction method, the original approach, which was weighted average of wind or solar generation, or alternative approach, which is simple average, but a targeted sample. The sample size or sample would be only those hours where load is high enough for that actual generation matters and actually is helping with reducing capacity needs. So if we apply the ENLR approach, the original approach for these two shows us very limited, some difference between the two cases, which is more reasonable. And if we go based on, if you look at this, 50%, if we say only target your sample data only to hours where load is higher than 50%. This is threshold load. If it's more than 60%, only pick up samples for those hours where load is above 60% of the maximum, or 70% of the maximum, 80% of the maximum. If we use these samples, at least for this concocted example, you see the numbers start to stabilize, actually. Now, we use this methodology and this thinking to calculate the qualifying capacity of wind and solar resources based on actual load and solar and wind generation as we downloaded them. I expect that we downloaded this data carefully and accurately, but we downloaded them from CAISO's Oasis site, But no guarantee that we may have missed a number or two. And by the way, we can send that data to everybody. And also we have the exact number of megawatts of interconnection capacity for the years between 2019 and 2021. Because every year the amount of interconnection capacity changes, and by the fact that it changes, it makes a difference on how to calculate the whether you use exceedance method or eslr method, how to calculate the numbers. If you use the exceedance method, these are what we see for 4 p.m. August time slice. So this is 4 p.m. for any day of August. So that's 31 days. 4 p.m. is 1 hour for every day. That's 31 days. And then 3 years for which we could find the data. That's 93 samples. We had 93 samples for our ending 4 p.m., which is around, we consider, let's say, it's gross peak load condition. Solar qualifying capacity for 50% exceedance was about 71%, and gradually went, as you increase the exceedance level, it went down to 61%. Wind QC started at about 25% and went down to about 14% at 80% exceedance. Now, for that same hour, if you used the original eslr that we proposed, and we know what the issue is and why these numbers are so small. So, but when we do for targeted sampling, in other words, look at wind and solar generation only when load is higher than 50% or 60% or 70%, 80%. If once we do that, we see that solar and QC is a lot more, solar QC is a lot more stable. Well, again, this is average of the total sample. People could, rather than using average or mean, could pick median. For all the hours where load is above 50% or 60%, 70%, 80%. And wind qualifying capacity is around 26%. We have one number at 28%. This is the hours where load was higher than 70%. And obviously, if we only focus the sample size to hours where load was more than 70%, we may see more wind days, more windy days, and that's why this number is bigger than this number. But this number matters more because this corresponds to days where load was higher. And when we look at when the load is about above 80% of the maximum load, in other words, we make things, then we get a combination of high and low wind days, and we get this kind of numbers. We also looked at the our 8 p.m., which is in August time slice. Again, a sample of a 93 a sample of 93 data points, which is supposed to be around net peak load. And solar, for exceedance, solar is at 50%, about 2%, and at 80% falls to 0.7%. No surprises there. For wind, it keeps on going lower, obviously, as the exceedance goes higher. Again, we have very limited sample, and that's where the fear of applying exceedance comes in. If you use our original eslr approach, where we calculate weighted average of wind or solar production, these are the numbers. Again, we found, as also pointed to us by one other person involved in this area, we noted why these numbers are so much lower than what what any other approach would have done. But then when we went for targeted sampling, only sample wind and solar generation when the load was above 50% of the maximum, or 60% of the maximum, or 70% of the maximum, 80% of the maximum. We see both the numbers stabilizing, at least when we're using the mean or average number, and also better representative, especially here, for wind and solar generation during the times where capacity matters more. In other words, when the load is at 70% of the maximum or 80% of the maximum or higher. So this is it. This was, we wanted to just bring to attention that effective load, net load reduction approach can be, there's a different implementation of it, which has the advantage of better correlating generation with load needs. And since ELCC's basic principle is to make sure that capacity only matters, or generation only matters when it actually reduces load. And if it doesn't reduce load, yeah, you can have a lot of capacity. Exceedance can show you a ton of capacity, but if load doesn't need it, it's of no value. So ELCC is the reason why it's the best approach is because it shows the real value of production. This approach also comes close to that because it focuses on only data samples where load is high and needs the capacity. And we decided to call it, why not call it simplified ELCC? Maybe this was going beyond rules of scientific research, but it's similar, at least in principle, is similar to ELCC, where production matters, generation matters only if it helps, not when it doesn't help. Like when we have load is 55%, who cares what the generation is? 55% of the maximum, who cares what generation is? With that, we have plenty of time, I guess, to ask questions, and I'm sure there will be questions.
There are. I've got a list here, and I think, Kyle, let's ask yours first, because I think it will help set some of the other answers, and then after Kyle, Ed, Alan, Noah, Rick, Kathleen.
Thanks, Julia. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I think Rick is asking the same question I have later on in the chat, and it's basically what's the maximum you're comparing to here? Are you talking about like the monthly maximum load, the hour within a month over a sample of years? Could you clarify?
Yes, it will be the maximum load for 4 p.m. So if I'm looking at years 2019 to, I'm assuming you can see my screen, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. If you're looking at year 2019 to 2021, I have 93 samples, and I'm looking at 4 p.m. of August. One slice, which is 4 p.m. of August, I have 93 samples. It will be the peak load for that one 4 p.m. August for these 3 years. So that will be the peak load I would consider. Because every slice will have its own, in this new world, every slice will have its own attributes to be attended to. So we only look at the peak load for that slice based on all the samples we have for that slice.
Can the questioners please remember to tell what their affiliation is? Thank you.
Yes, that's Kyle Navis from Public Advocate's Office, and thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
Great. Ed, and I know that you have 3 questions, so go ahead. Ed, are you able to unmute? Let's see if he's okay. I can read off his first question if you can't. Or can you, so for those, is the eslr approach compatible with a 24-day slice RA framework?
Hi, Julia. This is Ed. Can you hear me now?
Yes. And
yeah, thank you for reading that question. That's sort of the fundamental question is for Dariush is whether this ENLR approach is useful for the 24-hour slice or whether it's really more tailored for a 2-slice, net peak and gross peak slices.
No, it's applicable for 24-hour approach. It's I simply used, for example, these 2 hours because they are the sexiest hours in the year. 4 p.m. in August, which is supposedly close to peak gross load, peak load, and 8 p.m. In August, which is close to net peak, maximum net peak load, is sort of not net peak load for the year. But yeah, we can do the same thing. These 93 data samples are available for every hour of every day of the month. So we can easily, this is definitely applicable to 24-hour slice approach.
So Dariush, for the solar industry, I think we are comfortable using, the multiple years of NREL weather data to simulate what the production profile would be for a solar project of a specific design, say a single axis tracker. I recognize that for the wind industry, it may be different because the wind output is really very site specific and you need to gather actual data for that site to be able to come up with a production profile. So would you agree that maybe there should be different approaches for wind and solar?
But this approach is easily applicable to cases where you're looking at maybe future production, provided that you agree on a weight for them. If you look at future production and you want to just simply use exceedance, in other words, you're saying, I'm going to produce this much, but I don't know what my gross load is, and ELCC will capture that correlation. This approach captures correlation, but maybe we have to think about how to deal with target sampling for future, but definitely Exceedance totally forgets about the fact that whether that capacity is needed or not.
So Dariush, there's going to be multiple load serving entities in California that are responsible for filing RA submittals, and they will all have varying load profiles. We're going to have a bottoms-up approach, apparently, based on what the Energy Commission is saying. So to correlate historic production profiles with each of the LSC's load profile seems like a very, very complicated procedure.
Well, if we do this this approach is easily adaptable to zonal, to individual unit approach. So we can, if we go back and use this approach on either individual resources or individual LSC or individual zone and calculate these numbers, these QC, the effect is to calculate the QCs for various resources. And we can target, this approach is simply you look at historical data for resources that happen to be contracted with a specific LSC or reside in a particular geography or a particular technology or a particular unit. And then the simple idea is they are, whether it's however we tie it back to the load need, we have to tie it back to the maximum, the system load need that system needs, as opposed to that LSC's particular because system load need is the one that determines the value of that resource for that particular slice, 1 hour slice. So if we calculate these numbers for various resources or resources within a zone, very specific resources or resources within a zone, and do the targeted sampling as we're proposing now, or weighted average as our old method, based on actual system need, then we have qualifying capacity for all these resources sorted out based on whether the system needs it, whether they provide actual QC or not. And as we have said before, we definitely need to know things from bottom up in order to identify allocations, whether it's QC or a shortfall and so on. And also we need from top down to see whether how much system capacity we need. And to me, bottom up could be used for allocation, top down could be used for actual determining actual system need. People sometimes say, no, let's determine actual system need bottom up and then normalize it backward based on total system need. That's the same thing. They're saying the same thing. So I don't think there is anything here that would have an. The idea here is to identify qualifying capacity of resources, and use that for future procurements and need whether we have enough resources in. And I don't think there's anything.
We're going to need to identify what the RA values are for the slices for projects that are not yet in operation, that don't have historic data. So we're going to have to do some sort of simulation. You know, maybe we do it by geographical area or by zones, or maybe even by technology. But we need to simplify it down to a limited number of options so that this is a doable process for the load-serving entities. And it needs to be something that works going forward for technologies that are not yet online and may not even have samplings of wind data for the specific locations.
I must admit that any approach you go after, you will have this unknown, where you will not know. Again, with this, we can develop qualifying capacity or RA capacity, depending on how deliverability is accounted for. You can account for RA capacity of resources on in any granularity you want, so that if in the future you want to buy a particular type of wind in a particular place, you can say, okay, this is what QC it gives me because that's what historical data shows. But if it's a unique technology going into a unique location, I think regardless of the approach we pick, methodology we pick, we will have a challenge. We have to somehow make, we have to do certain simulations, and we can then bring the simulations and fit it into this model. I don't think there is I don't see a barrier here. And it's a very simple approach. I prefer ELCC, but I can see ELCC being very difficult. Especially if you have to repeat it 288 times per year.
Thanks, Julie. I won't ask any more questions. Thanks for opening up.
But you can reach out to me and we can chat about this as much as you want.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Darius. I'll come back to you too. I just want to make sure we get to everybody else. So, Alan.
Hi, Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. I think that you've answered most of the questions that I had, but can you go back to your slide 5?
Slides 5. Okay, there we go. Is this nice? Oh, this is slide 5.
There we go. Yeah. Can you explain what is the left column there? Is that the peak load that you're measuring against?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And so how does that?
Go ahead.
So how does that impact your data? So like 95% of peak load, then what does that mean for the data that you're pulling from sample 1 and sample 2?
Okay. So first of all, these are hourly production, one sample, second sample. This one shows the peak load in percentage of peak load. So obviously sample number 3 has the peak load, and samples 1, the other samples have in percentage of this load at this particular hour. So that's what it is. Now, if I'm, for example, targeted sampling and my load threshold is 80%, then the only data samples I'm going to look for sample 1 are this one, because it's above 80%, this one, which is above 80%, this one. Then I won't do any of these. I'll do this one, and this one. So I have 5 samples to pick from, and I just average those samples.
I see.
And if I go, say, for sample 2, if I'm looking at 60%, I look at every hour where the load was more than 60%. So this, most of them except these 2 will count. And well, actually, except for this one. This is the only one sample that I won't pick.
Okay, that makes sense. And so my other question is sort of the flip side of Ed's question then. Does this work for the TwoSlice proposal?
It will easily.
Can you, it seems like there's a lot of people wondering about that in the chat. Can you maybe elaborate on how you would see that working?
Well, I would not. Okay, the TwoSlice proposal that being discussed, the way Vistra is describing it, I don't know if that's changed anything. The heavy discounting that they discuss about, these are the numbers I calculate for slice number 2 and slice number 1, the 2 peak gross load and the peak load, gross peak load and net peak load, or peak gross load and peak net load, whatever. These are the numbers I would pick for qualifying capacity of wind, and I would not discount them as the way Vistra talks about. But this is as far as I can go without having more discussions with Vistra about why what they do.
Yeah, hey Darius, this is Kathleenlbert from Vistra. I'm actually not understanding what you're saying about discounting. I trust you that I've said something that has meant that to you. Can you explain?
My understanding of your approach was that if a resource is not available all hours of the day, you would sort of reduce the qualifying capacity to reflect the fact that they're not available all hours of the day, even though for that particular 1 hour slice, which is 8 p.m. in August, they may produce a qualifying capacity, regardless of the approach, of more than, say, 34%. But you would discount it because they're not, you don't know if they're going to be available at 6 p.m. or not going to be available at 11 p.m. I thought that was the type of discounting, or I may be misunderstanding your approach.
Yeah, no, thanks for clarifying. I think you may have taken more precision away from what we've discussed. My understanding of where we are, the 2 slices, is there are options for net peak that we have put forward, and it really is dependent on how you go about defining that requirement to get to kind of how the expected output would be set in the sufficiency test, because we haven't and so what we've said is that if we pick a 2 slice, we need to do follow-up workshops to pick an option for the requirement and then determine what's the best way to adjust a single NQC based on some kind of expected output, which happy to consider, you know, in that kind of forum options, of course. But yeah, thanks for letting me clarify.
Thank you.
Noah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have my hand raised.
Oh, okay. I did see some chats and questions in the. I just want to double check that.
Yeah, actually, Alan asked some of those questions already, so I think Dariush covered it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And Alan, I just want to make sure, was there anything else in your questions before I jump to the next person?
I would maybe like a little bit more of a fuller explanation on how you see this working with the TwoSlice proposal. So would you have to forecast each month what you think your net load and peak load hours are going to be, and then you would apply ENLR to those hours? Is that how it would work?
As
Here,
I
need to help a little, I can at least tee up a starting place. Okay, because I'll share with you all my favorite option of the options, and then you can go from there. So my favorite of the net peak is actually, so perform the LOLE. That gets you to your gross peak requirement, but then for the net peak requirement, kind of you could look at it as like a heat map, but look at all of the hours, identify the hour with the largest expected unserved energy that does not overlap with a gross peak. So if it happened to be the same, just don't include that. But the largest expected unserved energy risk that we hold, which we expect would be during net peak. And this is why I also think the proposal is flexible, right? So if that largest risk is in a different hour over time, that's what you would pick. And then that hour becomes what you would need to test in your sufficiency test. If you did it as a slice, you'd have to do, like, so we had, I think, 4 different options. Some were slices, some took this more specific approach. You could do it as an average of expected unserved energy. You could do it as, like, you could do so many different ways, but my favorite is picking the worst hour in the LOLE study for EUE and then testing to that hour. Just to, not proposing it. We still think we need the workshops to refine it, but that's my favorite.
Dariush, you want to add anything to that, or Alan, before I jump to Rick?
No, I must say that I reserve all discussions of a two-slice approach, except that what we calculate is qualifying capacity of variable energy resources, and they could apply for 24-hour slices or 2 slices based on the simple approach that we talked about.
Okay, I'll go to Rick, and then Kathleen, you're after Rick.
Great, thank you. Dariush, thanks for this. I really appreciate the thinking that's gone into this. I guess my question is, in the context, since let's move away from the two-slice proposal for a second and just think about the sort of the SCE 24-slice approach. I mean, because load is already, you know, in that, I mean, the way it's set up is load's already there. So isn't ENLR sort of, in a sense, kind of double counting? I mean, you're already looking at month hour, you know, we're looking at for some kind of month hour qualifying capacity for variable energy resources, right? Whether that's Exceedance or ENLR. But it seems like because the framework's already looking at the performance of those resources against, you know, max load in that hour framework, I mean, isn't ENLR sort of in a kind of double counting? Because load's already in there, right? I mean, you're already, so I guess I'm just curious if you can sort of address your thinking.
Well, can you please identify your affiliation?
Oh, I'm very sorry. Rick O'Connell with Grid Lab.
Okay, let me, maybe I can show you this. Okay, I'm gonna show you this. Hang on. Right. Maybe this one will help. Okay.
You're going to make me put on my reading glasses, Dariush?
Unfortunately, this is I don't know how to do this any better, but I just wanted to let you know these are actually presumably the actual data from that exists between years 2019 and 2021. This is all the month of August. So this is one slice for the month of August, and that slice for hour 16. You see that? This is one slice for hour 16. And this is for year 2019 to 2021. And this is the data that's available from CAISO Oasis site. We don't have all the data. We would have shown it and used it. In the amount of solar and wind generation for the 3 years are here. And everything has to be adjusted accordingly. And that's why everything is shown in percentages, because higher production in 2020 doesn't simply mean higher qualifying capacity, because we have more generation interconnected in the system. So we have to do all that adjustments in all that calculation. And if you look at the gross load, this is 1 hour, hour ending 16. This is the gross load. This gross load changes anywhere from as little as it can be as low as about 25,000 megawatt to as high as, I think, 47,000 megawatt. This one is 47,000 megawatt. This happened in the 18th day of August and hour ending 16 in year 2020, and was as low as, I think, 25,000 megawatt, which was, again, hour ending 16, again, month August. This is that particular slice. And this is for day number 21. So the load can vary quite a bit in that 1 hour. It's not like we have one load number only. The load changes quite a bit. And then our basically proposal is focus on days where load is higher, and look at solar generation or wind generation only for days where the capacity or generation really counts, where the load is 44,000 megawatt or 39,000 megawatt. So, and then account for those. And of course, so that's what the idea is.
And sorry, Dariush, can you just, in column M, can you expose the formula there? Is that just column H divided by the max of column H? Like your PU, your per unit of load percentage in column M.
If you look at it's
just the max.
In that here over the maximum of the load. By the way, if anybody wants this spreadsheet, I'm more than happy to send it to them so that they can see how all these geeky stuff works. It's not very difficult either, but it's just. And
Dariush, I apologize if you covered this before, but you're only using 2019 through 2021 because that was the data available from Oasis. But clearly, we'd want to use more. We'd want to use more years than this.
If I had more years, I would use more years. Yes.
Yeah.
And by using the actual interconnection capacity, I'm comfortable that I'm not going to combine apples with oranges and so on.
Okay. Thanks. I mean, I think I understand your approach.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you both. Okay, Kathleen.
Thanks. This is Kathleenlbert from Vistra. I had a couple questions, Dariush. I actually just wanted to make sure that I'm remembering the context for the calculation first. I just wanted to confirm that my memory that the proposal is to come up with a net load, come up with this QC, and then subtract it from gross peak to get to kind of a net load, or subtract it from gross load, sorry, to get to a net load, and then PRM, et cetera, would apply after that. But it would reduce the demand target.
Actually, after some discussion,
Sure.
well, that was the intent, but the reason I presented it originally in that context is I wanted to emphasize that only when high load is reduced that that generation matters. But eventually, I'm only using generation as is, so or load as is. I mean, a generation of so that concept was unnecessarily complicating the presentation. It's simply solar generation and wind generation, and I'm focusing on those. I'm not, and of course, every megawatt of solar generation would reduce, can reduce the net load, and so that was maybe more in the context of introducing the idea, but I'm simply using net generation. I mean, I'm simply using solar generation and wind generation, and either based on the original approach, either adjusting its impact based on a ratio of load at the time of generation versus peak load for that particular time slice, or this approach, which I'm simply taking the mean only for hours where load is above a threshold load that to be defined by all of us if we go this approach. And I somehow find the approach of targeted sampling to be, that I discussed today, to be a lot more stable, and especially if we have limited number of sample points.
Okay, no, that's super helpful, and I see Rick's response as well. I just wanted to I just wanted to confirm that that if we were talking, what we were talking about on demand side or supply side. So now that I'm anchored, that we're talking about you're proposing a QC approach for counting of supply side resources.
Right.
The thing I just want to share, the thing I struggle with often, even with targeted sampling, is that when how appropriate is the way that you go about slicing and dicing a data set to get to a sample? Is, anyone who does this kind of work regularly knows that's the art that kind of also goes with the science. So I think one thing I'm struggling with is load itself. So I don't see a causal relationship between wind output and load, or solar output and load. And I think you're using it as a proxy for tight periods and saying, let's only look at the output when things are tight. Is that correct?
So yeah, let me cover 2 points here. One is the correlation between solar and load and wind and load. This correlation does exist. Let's focus on hour ending 16, which is 4 p.m. in August. If it's a very sunny day with the high pressure sitting on California, the load is expected to be high. I mean, I'm talking about gross load. Is expected to be high, and solar generation is expected to be high as well. So, so there is intuitively, you see that that correlation, that high pressure means higher temperatures, sunny day, higher load, and higher solar generation. High pressure means air is frozen, there is very little wind, so high pressure, higher temperature, higher load means lower wind. So there is this correlation, and that is present, at least can be observed on intuitive level. And if we have big enough sample, we can probably see that correlation, positive correlation between solar and load, solar generation and load at hour ending 14, hour ending 16. We can probably see that, but based on a statistical analysis. And we can see a negative correlation based on a statistical analysis for wind. So I want to say that correlation should exist. And the second one, which is important, is regardless of what intuition tells us and so on, here we are focusing on data. We are saying if wind generation happened to be on a day where load is low, that wind generation does not, regardless of what level it is, should not matter, because load does, the system doesn't need that wind generation. If load is high, whatever that wind generation or solar generation is, the system needs it. That should count towards determining the qualifying capacity of the wind or solar resource. Because if you're counting it, we are targeting it, we're doing this targeting sampling based on times where the system actually needed. And this is what ELCC exactly does. And we have sort of came up with this, I would call it a loose term. As a geek, I would call it a loose term, simplified ELCC.
Okay, I just have two follow-ups and then I will give this back up. My first follow-up is I appreciate intuition, but I actually think that providing it even a simple correlation coefficient is so simple that I would have suggested starting there. Simple correlation coefficient would help the dialogue. My second piece of feedback is that I think that it is still, you're still at, even if you get to that, there's correlation does not equal causation. And so I think there is still an issue of, is it the right metric for isolating the hours to be included in your calculation? I would just make a suggestion to think about, if we are performing an LOLE, period, ELCC is the next step. But if you are performing an LOLE, it identifies the loss of load expectation hours. And could that be something you could leverage that would be a little bit closer? Just a couple things to think about.
Well, I'm completely in agreement with you. As something like LOLE should be used to determining the amount of capacity we need. This approach is simply to say, okay, how much capacity various resources bring to the table. But I am totally in agreement with you that we should use LOLE type approach rather than simply grabbing 15% or 18% from the air to determine the level of capacity we need.
What I'm suggesting, and we can talk offline, is that you could actually use the LOLP hours to identify the hours to do your calculation. But reach out to me and we can talk more.
Okay.
Thank you both. Great. And then I wanted to go back to Ed, and then I see Bridget too. So Ed, did you want to ask a couple more of your questions? Okay, and if you do, just raise your hand again, and then I'll go to Bridget. Thank you.
Okay, so I kind of had a similar struggle that Kathleen has been wrestling with. Is there's something that feels off about this method because, again, there's not a direct correlation between load and solar output. They're indirectly correlated through both being correlated with weather. And so even if you get, there's no predictive power in solar output with the load level necessarily, because if you increase 1 megawatt of load, doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to see an increase megawatt of solar output if the weather's different than historic patterns. So that's one thing. My other question is, okay, maybe if I could kind of be persuaded that this is a reasonable sampling framework, one thing that might also be helpful is maybe look at the variance in the sample that you would get at the different levels. So is solar output really more similar to each other at these different load levels than just a basic sort of exceedance level? So if solar output is more concentrated at, you know, higher levels of load, and that would mean to me that your QC value is more representative of what you could possibly get at similar load levels in the future. Or if there's still the same variance between your methodology and what we might see with exceedance, in my mind, there's not really anything gained by doing this more complicated method than just a simple exceedance. So that's maybe one thing you want to look at is like the variance in the different samples you might get from these different sampling frameworks. Might also kind of help us better judge whether this is a robust methodology compared to others. So that's maybe one thing I'd suggest. And then I do kind of echo Ed's question in the chat is, you know, wind and solar in the future is going to be more necessary for charging storage. And so even if it's not being served for load, it could possibly be dispatched to charge a storage fleet even at peak, because we're getting ready for the net load peak. So just that it is reducing load isn't the only reason why wind and solar output would matter in the future, especially as we get more and more storage on the grid. And so, you know, I think ELCC can kind of pick up those, you know, interaction effects between those two resources. And so, you know, maybe for now, your methodology might be useful, but as we get more and more storage, you know, how do we account for the fact that load is not just serving energy demand, but it's also charging demand for storage resources as part of that sort of new load of the future, and how we might kind of think about the value of solar storage in that way. So those are just a couple thoughts. Thanks.
I must admit that I agree. If you go in towards a world where we have about 50,000 megawatt of storage in the system, maybe none of this matters. But in the context of whether wind or solar contribute to the capacity needs of the system, regardless of when, they're still needed. But maybe we will discount that value as we get more and more storage, because we say we have capacity for all hours, so really capacity contribution of wind and solar doesn't matter anymore. But in any context, if you are looking at capacity value of wind and solar resources, we need to have a way of doing it, and this is the approach. And the only difference between this and potentially exceedance, and I want to warn you about the follies of exceedance with especially limited sample data, and is that this one, regardless of how you look at it, ELCC does it very effectively and inherently. It's a very complex approach, so you don't see it, but it makes sure that your generation only matters if it reduces load, if it impacts capacity need. And here we are trying to capture that by saying we should only target our sampling for those hours where the capacity shortage may exist, and that's usually for 1 hour. If you're focusing on 1 hour, well, one slice, maybe a 4-hour slice in the old PG&E approach, is only for those times where the load is the highest. or above a certain threshold, and that's the idea behind this. I really want to warn against the follies of exceedance if you have limited sample data. And I showed a simple example of you can end up with 100 megawatt, 1,000 megawatt is simple, but I'm not sure how badly we will see that, but we have to be careful about exceedance method.
Thank you, Bridget. Thanks, Darius. There, Rick, your hand is still up. Do you have another question? And then there's also a comment from Kathleen in the chat.
Sorry.
No worries. We all do it.
Hi, this is Brian Beering for ACP. May I jump in?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So Brian Beering for American Clean Power Association of California. Darius, thank you for running through this. We've, throughout this whole process, shared the very same concerns about how Exceedance treats wind, and really appreciate you thinking through a methodology that can address that in the context of the SCE 24-hour slice framework. So appreciate you getting that into the record. I wanted to circle back on Ed's question about whether or not in the 24-hour framework you could have an exceedance methodology for solar and your method for wind. Is that compatible with the methodology you developed?
It could work. I think this approach is maybe crediting solar more than exceedance method. And as at least the sample data shows and the thinking shows, as I expressed and it's more stable as well. The results are more stable. I'm not sure much will be gained from using this two different approaches, but yeah, it could work. It could work. I don't have a strong opinion one way or another. I'm really worried about applying exceedance to wind, really. And based on all the cases I have done, I've noticed that the NLR approach, or simplified ELCC approach, shows similar results that as exceedance, but a lot more stable results.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Darius. And I referenced the comment from Kathleen asking about providing descriptive statistics and correlation statistics on the data set.
Okay, I got to read up on Excel to see to calculate those things for me.
And I just put in the chat again the link that Lisa had earlier about all the different materials that we will have presented today. Are there additional questions for Kalia and Darius? I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you also to Kathleen and Vistar earlier, and to PG&E and Peter and Luke. Really appreciate all of your time. Wanted to open up the floor for any overall additional Q&A that the group wants to highlight. And as you're queuing up, I just wanted to reiterate the timeline. So the next and final workshop is a UCAP and multi-year on Wednesday, the 19th of January. If you are interested in presenting at the workshop, please contact the co-facilitators by this Friday, and then send the materials to the facilitators by the 14th. And then the next set of informal comments are due Wednesday, the 26th, on hedging, today's discussion, UCAP, and the multi-year workshops. And all the additional information is posted in the link that I just re-presented in the chat. Don't see any additional questions, but Lisa, Peter, is there anything else that you want to add, or any of the other co-facilitators? Would you like to add anything today? There is one thing I wanted to flag. The co-facilitators are meeting this Friday to discuss starting to pull together the document, the draft report of all the materials, and we'll report out after that. Okay.
Yeah, Julie, I don't think I have any more to say on this or suggest. I mean, just other than we've got a recap and, you know, we're moving forward on the steps.
Yes. Again, we'll appreciate everyone's time today, your great questions and input and conversation, and wish you all again a very happy new year and look forward to working with all of you. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for your time. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you all. Bye.